Time to bring it forward again. And the last time I testified, I did quote the scriptures, Madam Chair, and the book of Proverbs, chapter 6. The scripture says that these 6 things doth the Lord hate. And 7 are detestable unto him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, and feet that are quick to rush to evil, and a false witness who pours out lies, and a person who stirs up conflict in the community. Hands that shed innocent blood. Madam Chair, the reason I brought this up is I've interviewed at least 4 individuals who were on death row. Different circumstances for each, and I believe one is here to testify today. But being on death row for 11, 23, even longer, in itself, if you're innocent, is cruel and unusual. I believe it was John Adams who said that he would rather let 1,000 men go that were guilty than one innocent person be executed, and I do paraphrase. I think nowadays we can look to any news channel and we can see that our justice system is under question. And it is not foolproof. Not too long ago, we saw 4,000 specimens of DNA that were tampered with in our neighboring state. There was 4,000. If any one of those were used in a death penalty case, can you imagine convicting somebody wrongfully because somebody falsely testified? There's the lying tongue. We have witnesses that I've interviewed that were innocent, but because of a prosecuting attorney withholding exculpatory evidence, the person was on death row for at least 11 years. Could that happen here in New Hampshire? Can anybody guarantee that it can't? Can anybody guarantee that our DNA cannot be tampered with? What if we have a prosecuting attorney that wants to put a notch on their belt and does the exact same thing? What are the guarantees? I don't have it before you, but I did have a fiscal note prepared that I believe there is a person who is on death row now that it would cost at least $1.3 million for that person to stay in the penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. But the process, this person in a death penalty case, is approximately $5+ million because of appeals. In itself, in my opinion, that is an injustice to society. Our system is broken in that something that is being processed, one case, $5 million+. Where housing that person is a fraction. So whether it's for spiritual, for fiscal, common sense, I brought this bill in because I think it's time for us to re-examine the need for it. I've heard people say, well, I'm for the death penalty because I'm for the victims. Well, I appreciate that, but I'm also for the victims as well. But why are we creating more victims of the taxpayers to process something that just the costs go nuts? And there are no guarantees that we're always 100% right. If we execute somebody that is innocent, their blood is on our hands, and I believe biblically that is a tragedy. So with that, I will rest my testimony. Any questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Are there any questions? Seeing none, thanks. Mr. Sheldon, did you find us to speak?
Madam Chairman.
Good afternoon.
I'm Chuck Douglas. I appear here on behalf of myself, a lawyer here in Concord, and 44 years ago, In the 74 session, Warren Rudman and I rewrote the death penalty statute that you want to repeal in the Senate bill before you. It was a very narrow drafting job because we agreed that only certain types of crimes should be covered by the death penalty, so that not every situation where someone died in a robbery or arson would be covered, and it has been very narrowly applied, as you know. There are two problems with the bill, and the major one is that it would free from the penalty Michael Addison, and I think that's wrong. When the courts have ruled, and it's still on appeal, to prospectively repeal the death penalty may sound good, but anyone who votes yes is vacating Michael Addison's death penalty. And you need to know that going into it, because every court that has ever ruled on this, the most recent being Connecticut, has said once the legislature prospectively repeals the death penalty, everyone on death row gets resentenced to life or life without parole. That is a consequence. I have not seen the Attorney General's memo, but it would be certainly wise, if you are concerned about that fact, to send the bill to the Supreme Court for an advisory opinion as to whether or not that is the actual consequence of this so-called prospective repeal. And the other thing I would like to say is that if the folks that supported the hate crime resolution, which is in the House, has come over to you folks in the Senate, one of the reasons they put in a hate crime resolution is they think it would have a deterrent effect on people who are motivated by race, creed, religion to take the lives of others. I would suggest that you do what would be the most strong deterrent and add one sentence to the death penalty law that would have the penalty of death if the motivation to take human life was because of hostility towards the victim's actual or perceived religion, race, creed, national origin, sex, or sexual orientation. That's the statute that Dylan Roof was sentenced under in South Carolina. Similar language in the law that applied to him. And if ever someone in New Hampshire commits a murder of people in a church, mosque, or synagogue because of a religious bias motivation, to me, that would call for the ultimate penalty. And I'll close by saying I do have a written summary. I'm not going to read it as the chair requested, but I also have copies of Governor Shaheen's veto message 18 years ago when she vetoed the death penalty repeal, and finally anticipating the argument about DNA and all of the folks who've been wrongfully convicted. I would just suggest that the one person who's on death row right now, Michael Addison, there is no question, because defense, Addison killed Briggs. There's no doubt they got the right guy, because in the opening statement his lawyer said, "We do not deny that he killed Officer Briggs." So all the drama from Texas and everywhere else is interesting, but it's not the Addison case, where the state and the defense agreed he did it. And with that, I'd be glad to take questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Any questions? Senator Lasky.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Attorney Douglas, for being here. His penalty as it is.
I honestly don't remember. I know I was here taking the same position I've taken for 44 years. But I don't remember if you had threaded the needle or not, because the practical problem, Senator, is I don't think the bill was that clear at the time, and I don't know what language we were kicking around in. I just apologize. I can't remember.
Again, thank you for bringing it to our attention, and certainly, as we...
I'll submit this, if I may.
Okay.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, good afternoon. For the record, my name is Patrick Cheatham. I'm a police officer and lieutenant with the Londonderry Police Department, where I've worked for the last 15 years. I sit before you today as the president of the New Hampshire Police Association, which is a fraternal association of police officers from around our great state and numbering more than 2,000. We oppose this bill, and we ask that you do as well. I do have written testimony to submit, as written by Sergeant John Yurkat of the Nashua Police Department. He could not be here today to offer that testimony. The Sergeant Yurkat is nearly a 20-year veteran of the Nashua Police Department, and he recently retired from the United States Marine Corps after 30 years of dedicated service, and a recognized expert on this matter, and I will submit this written testimony at the conclusion of my verbal testimony with your permission. We believe that certain crimes, known as capital crimes, here in our state should be met with the ultimate punishment, that is death. We believe that the statute on the death penalty here in New Hampshire as written and as currently on file is appropriate and just, and we ask that it remain as such. I concur with Justice Douglas, and I recognize all of his comments and thank him for his testimony, because we too believe that Part 2 of this bill will ensure that Michael Addison's death sentence be overturned. We saw it recently in 2012 in Connecticut in the Dr. Pettit case, when his wife and children were brutally murdered by two men who had committed a home invasion in their home, and I think we all remember seeing that in the news. And that's just 2 states away here in New England. I have had the opportunity to read the Attorney General's memo on this very issue, and they cannot say with any degree of confidence that any amendment to this bill would require Michael Addison to meet the ultimate punishment. And in fact, this bill, as presented, could be interpreted by the New Hampshire Supreme Court and others as such to retroactively overturn that decision. We believe that from the bottom of our hearts, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak here today. Thank you.
The chair will call Sarah Blodgett.
I'm Sarah Blodgett with the New Hampshire Judiciary Council. I believe, as most committee members know, the council is responsible for overseeing the indigent defense delivery system as well as the quality of the representation that's provided. The council has not taken a policy position on this bill. I'm here in the limited capacity of testifying on the costs that we have seen to date. As you'll see in the fiscal note, defense costs to date are over $2.8 million. This case began in October of 2006. This is all Michael Addison related, and it is still ongoing. We were able to have the public defender handle representation on the underlying matter. The documents that are being passed out now are a summary of the Superior Court case and the initial appeal to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. And I think it will just give you an overview of how these costs have become so astronomical. This is a very complex area of law. It has to be very aggressively litigated because of the stakes involved. Because the public defender handled the underlying representation, post-conviction proceedings had to go to outside counsel. The Judicial Council developed standards for an attorney who could handle the representation at that phase. We only received 2 bids, and neither of the attorneys who put in a bid were from the state of New Hampshire. The public defender currently has the capacity to handle death penalty representations in terms of the experience of its attorneys, but our contract with the public defender does not include the costs that would be associated with that representation. The vast majority of the $2.8 million was for the public defender, attorney time, investigative costs, Now that we have outside counsel who's being reimbursed at a rate of $125 an hour, we are also paying for additional expert services. Those have been approved by the court before we will pay for them. But in this habeas proceeding, the attorney is not limited to an appeal on the record. They are basically re-examining the entire case and looking at any possible arguments that they can make. I had the chance to see the files that the public defender had. They have an entire room dedicated to file storage. There were over 100 banker boxes full of transcripts, evidence in the trial, and the new attorneys, as part of the representation on the post-conviction proceeding, have to go through all of that with a fine-tooth comb. That really is the extent of my testimony. I just wanted to give you that information on the costs that we've seen, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony this afternoon. Are there any questions? Would all appeals stop?
I don't know the answer to that. If his sentence, if the impact of this legislation was to vacate the death penalty part of his sentence, then I believe that the appeals would stop. But I will confirm that and let you know.
Because I would understand, but that wouldn't stop from any other appeal, would it?
Well, the appeal right now really is a habeas appeal, so I believe that that would continue, but there would be the possibility of a habeas petition the federal court, and I think that if the death penalty were vacated on this case, that would not. Thank you, Madam Chair.
My name is Andrew Shigori. Apologize for the kind of raspy voice. Getting over the flu. I'm the president of the Chiefs of Police in New Hampshire and the chief in Tufton Borough. We're opposed to this bill. I don't want to reiterate a lot of the things that Chuck Douglas and Pat Cheatham had previously said, but it's important that there was a study commission back, I believe in 2010, that concluded that our New Hampshire's capital murder statutes are consistent with evolving standards of decency, because in the state death penalty has consistently been accepted by the democratic process. The statutes are written to cover only a narrow category of murders. And it goes on. It'll be in my written testimony. But a couple of things that came up. I was glad somebody mentioned the Pettit murders down in Connecticut. I watched that with great interest, because one of the murderers, Joshua Komisarjevsky, lived in New Hampshire, and I dealt with him. He stalked a woman in Tufton Borough, and we had dealt with him on that matter. That well could have been someplace in our state. And the other interesting thing, the question that somebody just asked of the prior speaker about appeals. So Joshua Komisarjevsky, even though his sentence has been reduced, if you will, changed over, commuted to life without chance of parole, is still appealing. He still has appeals going to this date. It hasn't stopped the appeal process. So, and I think when you start hearing costs, and it can kind of get blurred in a couple different ways in the technical sense of it. Maybe that my mind goes too technical sometimes, but when we hear the average cost of having somebody imprisoned, well, that's including everybody, including the people that go 2 or 3 years in their 20s that have very low medical costs. It's averaged out. So, but you don't often hear what the cost of the geriatric prisoner costs are, which would be significantly more than the 20-year-old that's only in for a couple of years. So if you think you're saving on the cost side, those are probably your more expensive prisoners are your life without parole, your people that are going to die behind bars. Although, honestly, I don't think money should be, talking people's lives, I don't think money should be the primary driving factor for it. I think the good thing is that New Hampshire has only narrowly applied it, very few cases. Even something, Gordon Perry, who killed Jeremy Sharon, wasn't applied. I think we've shown a history of using it in the most restricted possible way. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Thank you. Mr. Shigori, I just have a question for you. I'm glad you brought up the issue of money, because we've heard already that this is going to save the taxpayers money. And is this really about justice, or is it about saving taxpayers money?
To me, I think it should be about justice and what's right. And we only apply it narrowly in those very strict cases where I think in the public has often felt that's the appropriate sanction under these most egregious cases. And I think, as the Honorable Chuck Douglas said earlier, these other states, well, hopefully, I don't think anything like that's ever been pointed to here. I'm a little frustrated when in a couple of bills that have come up this year when it's all about other states. Well, show that it's happening in New Hampshire. You know, that hasn't. And I don't think we should be judging people's lives by money as why they I think it's great that they spend so much on the defense because it is somebody's life that's at stake.
Thank you for your testimony. As I understand it, the last time the death penalty was used in the state was 1939. Is that correct?
That's correct. It was somebody out of Alton. Mr. Long, I believe it was. I believe he had raped and killed a young boy.
Right. And so there has not been a case since then where the death penalty was warranted?
There was another case. There were a couple of murder for hires that they ended up not going forward all the way. There was one. Huh? I can't remember the name. There was one in Bow that I think technically was never. They dropped the charges on it in one. And there was another one that they reduced the penalty down and got a plea. I think that's something to consider too. If the highest penalty is life without parole, then what inducement is there to plead down, if you will? I mean, there's some people that will offer up. In the case of the Pettit case, Hayes and Komisarjevsky offered to plead guilty. I mean, but they thought it was heinous enough that it needed to go further. But there may be some savings on some in that sense too. If it's the highest thing is life without parole, you're going to fight that all the way. I suppose that's a theoretical. That would be unethical of the attorney on their side to accept that. That would be unethical of the prosecutor. I think the reason why it's so rarely raised is because some of these other states, they elect their attorney general. They elect the judges. I mean, I think that gives some inducement for, how they might, versus being appointed till they're 70 here, versus being appointed for a set term. There's less likely to be swayed by the need to appease public opinion and get reelected because they are doing the right thing. And I think that's a difference than you have in some other states as to how that goes.
Okay. The chair, Joe Lorenzo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Joe Lorenzo. I've been a police officer in New Hampshire for 14 years, with the last 12 years at the Manchester Police Department. I'm also the Chief Steward with the Manchester Police Patrolmen's Association. I hesitate to tell you folks that originally I'm from Massachusetts, and this is certainly something that I would expect to see come out of the Massachusetts Congress and not a New Hampshire Congress, unfortunately. When I started my career, I feel like in subsequent years, the New Hampshire Congress passed a lot of good laws. I feel like they did a lot of good things to strengthen the criminal justice system, namely the expanding of the death penalty law. And when I started my career, I was 19 years old. I was working part-time in Hampton. And my father, he was the one that kind of pushed me to go to New Hampshire, stay in New Hampshire, not go back to Massachusetts. And his reasoning was New Hampshire does it right. He always kind of preached that New Hampshire does it right. See, my father, he was a 34-year veteran of the Lawrence, Mass. Police Department. And when he retired, he was a sergeant with the narcotics unit. And folks may not want to hear this, but when he worked collaboratively with the federal agencies like the DEA, he would always push that any sting operation would be done in New Hampshire, when all possible. And the reason for that is because he knew that any operation done in New Hampshire, if the feds didn't take it, the people he arrested, who were violent drug dealers, would at least see some jail time. He knew back in Massachusetts that they'd walk. And it's just not these everyday occurrences that he spoke about. In 1974, my father arrested Willie Horton. I'm sure many of you are aware of the story, but if not, Willie Horton killed a 17-year-old kid, stabbed him 19 times during a robbery. The great state of Massachusetts felt the need that to give Willie Horton 10 furloughs. They didn't believe that spending life in prison without parole was just. You need to get some time out there. So on his 10th furlough, which was 2 days after my second birthday, I know from hearing from my mom, obviously very frightened that this person would become seeking redemption. Fortunately for my parents, but unfortunately for the residents of Maryland, Willie Horton went down to Maryland. He raped and tortured a female and tortured her fiance. Maryland was able to recapture him and luckily didn't give him back to Massachusetts. And I know you're saying it's probably a big jump, to go from repealing the death penalty to issuing furloughs. But from what I've seen recently, I don't know if that's a big jump. I wouldn't be surprised if that came in 12 years or so, to New Hampshire. And again, I go back to my dad telling me to stay in New Hampshire. I never applied to be in Massachusetts, and he said stay in New Hampshire because they do it right. They do it right. And I have to tell you folks, if you repeal this, you're doing it wrong. And while I was listening to some other people speak, it also made me think, when Michael Briggs was killed, I was in the academy. So that was a little bit of a tough moment being in the academy, this is the career I'm going into, and here's someone that's killed in the line of duty. But here, New Hampshire was, and they did the right thing to prosecute him to the fullest extent. He's sitting on death row. And unfortunately, another Massachusetts story. I think back to, I believe it was 1992, Officer Duggan, a Lawrence, Mass. Police officer killed in the line of duty. So, being a young child, having your father work on that force is obviously something difficult to deal with. What do you think Massachusetts did? That person was set free. So, I ask you folks, to really think about this and do as my father saying, do the right thing, do the New Hampshire thing. I think if that's in the back of the mind, even just one person, just knowing that, it may keep people from coming up here to New Hampshire because criminals know that in New Hampshire it's a little bit tougher, it's a little bit more strict, and I do believe that it does have an effect on at least one person, and I think if those people at least stay out of New Hampshire and keeps one cop safe, I believe it's a just cause.
Thank you for your answer. Are there any questions?
I mean, it's such a hypothetical question. You'd have to ask, when I go back to the drug dealing and my father trying to set sting operations in New Hampshire as opposed to Massachusetts, why those failed, why people insisted on staying in Mass and not going to New Hampshire. It's such a hypothetical, but yes, I believe that, if you ask every criminal out there, between the two states, and if you could ask every single person, I believe one person was deterred by that fact. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The chair will call the Reverend Gail Avery.
My name is Gail Avery, and I'm an Episcopal priest, and I also am the canon for transition and community engagement. And I'm here really to represent our bishop's statement, which I do have. May I give it to you all? Great, good. And I am challenged. This is the first time I have been testifying, and to be able to say this in my own words. I do think that we have a time now before us with the legislators and our governor to really counteract the wave of violence and cruelty that has been surging our nation. And I know that there are innocent people on death row, and I'm not here to testify about Michael Addison. But as a follower of Jesus, taking the life of another person who has taken a life of another person, it just perpetuates the violence, and it's a cycle of vengeance and retribution. And as a follower of Jesus, I do believe in our gospel, it's a gospel of forgiveness and redemption and reconciliation. And I do wish that the governor will look at this bill seriously. I have heard that he is looking at repealing it, or actually vetoing it as it comes across his desk, and I just really would like him to look at this seriously and what New Hampshire continues to do, which is, I think, remaining the only state in New England that still has this seriously, and look at what we're doing as a state, and to really stop this killing.
Thank you very much for your testimony this afternoon, Reverend. Are there any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the panel. My name is Steve Merkin. I live in Rumney, New Hampshire. I've been a criminal defense lawyer for not quite 39 years, including 11 years of that as a staff attorney at the New Hampshire Public Defender. I want to make clear today I'm here just as an individual, not on behalf of the Public Defender. But from 1989 through 2012, I practiced law in Kentucky, both as a public defender and as a private attorney, and I represented a lot of people charged in death penalty cases. I was for several years a member of the State Public Defender's Death Penalty Task Force. I have represented, by best I can count, 18 clients in death penalty cases, have been defense counsel in 7 cases that have gone to trial as capital trials. So I've got a little bit of experience with the situation. There are now 19 states in the U.S. that have abolished the death penalty. New Hampshire is the only remaining state in the Northeast, from Maine to West Virginia, that still has a death penalty. Asterisk for Pennsylvania, theirs is still on the books, but they've been under an administrative embargo for several years now while they completely re-examine their system. There are a lot of reasons why the trend is to do away with the death penalty. 7 states have abolished it in the last 15 years. And we've already heard reference to a lot of these reasons. Number one, first and foremost, should be the concern about convicting and executing an innocent person. As of the last I checked, more than 160 people around the country have been exonerated after first being convicted of murders and sentenced to death. One of those was in Kentucky while I was there, 17-year-old kid, back when it was possible to sentence 17-year-olds to death. Spent, 5, 6, 7 years on death row, got a new trial, and was exonerated at his retrial. There are substantial questions of innocence for a lot of people, over a lot of people who have been put to death. A dozen or so that you can make a very strong case for. One guy, Cameron Willingham in Texas, I don't think anybody anymore pretends that he was guilty of the arson murder for which he was convicted and executed. Why do innocent people get convicted? Number of reasons. Misidentification by eyewitnesses, most common. That's been a factor in 75% of exonerations. Use of jailhouse informants, second most common. That still goes on very frequently here in New Hampshire. I've had cases I'm involved in now, cases I've been involved in over the years, both here and in Kentucky, where jailhouse informants were used in some cases who ultimately were proven to be dishonest. In one case, a murder case here in New Hampshire, jailhouse informant was pretty much the only thing the state had. And that individual was ultimately shown to have been committing perjury. And we were very, very fortunate that the Attorney General prosecuting that case was much more interested in determining the truth than she was at getting a conviction at any price. Very, very fortunate in that case. But it happens. Junk science is another one. Science that is subsequently delegitimized, and we've seen a number of these over the years. Microscopic hair comparison used to be a big thing. I had a capital case in Kentucky where that was an important piece of evidence that has now been acknowledged by the FBI to be junk science. It's been replaced by mitochondrial DNA which is much more effective. But for years, and you can go through the books of people who've been exonerated, microscopic hair analysis, comparative ballistic metallurgy. I've had 2 cases where someone from the FBI came in and said, this bullet fragment or this shotgun pellet from the crime scene, we put it through a gas chromatography, and it comes out to be the identical metallurgical makeup as this bullet or this set of pellets from a box of ammunition found in the defendant's possession. Therefore, defendant's gun, defendant's bullets. Yeah, the FBI finally had to abandon that because it was proven finally to just not be true. One of the FBI agents that I had testify in a case of mine in Kentucky was subsequently charged with perjury elsewhere in Kentucky for her testimony on that point, because by then not only had the science been delegitimized, but apparently she lied about it. I wasn't involved in that case, so I don't know the details. Arson science. Again, Cameron Willingham is dead in Texas because of an arson expert who applied the level of science that was recognized at that time to conclude that the fire that killed his children had to have been set. And guess what? A jailhouse informant who said, oh yeah, he told me he did it. Turns out again that the jailhouse informant was lying to try and cut his own deal, and the arson science has subsequently been discredited, but unfortunately Cameron Willingham's dead. Multiple participant cases where it's clear that there were more than one person involved in the killing. It's not clear who pulled the trigger. Many, many times the state makes the deal with the first one to put his hand up. Say, okay, you don't get death if you will point the finger at the other guy and he gets death. I've been on both sides of that. And I should tell you, because there's another very interesting point that's been raised about both the expense of this litigation and the time it takes. We've seen here with Mr. Addison, it's been, 9 years, 10 years? There's a long way to go. These cases take a lot of time. A guy I represented in Kentucky who was, again, one of 2 who committed the murder, but who pulled the trigger, depend on who you believed, and his co-defendant put his hand up first. Crime took place in 1991. My client was extradited back to Kentucky in 1995. It's now 23 years later. The litigation is still ongoing. He's been taken to trial 5 times. Either the conviction or the sentence has been reversed by the Kentucky Supreme Court, which is not a hotbed of liberalism, 4 times. This is a guy, by the way, who is already doing life without parole in other states. This is all because Kentucky wants to execute him. He is now in his 60s. He's, not the world's healthiest specimen. Don't know how much longer he's going to live. The estimate 5 or 6 years ago was that the state of Kentucky had spent about $10 million prosecuting that case. That was 5 or 6 years ago. It's still going on. Why don't we speed up the process? Well, the federal government tried that. The AEDPA, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, was enacted and signed in, I think, 1996, signed by President Clinton. That was designed to cut legal remedies way back, and it has. The speed of executions in Texas has picked up as a result of that. But it doesn't mean that people don't stop fighting and that they don't get due process before the state puts them to death. Deterrent effect. This is one we hear about a lot. And I can tell you both on a macro and a micro level, it doesn't exist. You would think that those states without the death penalty, if the death penalty had a deterrent effect, would be among the more violent. In fact, the opposite is true. The last year I could find figures for was 2015. 7 of the 10 states with the lowest murder rates were non-death states. Number 1, by the way, was New Hampshire. We have the lowest, at least in 2015, the lowest murder rate of any state in the country. So we're one of the death states, one of the 3 that are out of that 10. Of the states with the highest murder rates, 7 were death penalty states, and active death penalty states. You would think there would be some contrast you could draw from similar states that adjoin each other where one has the death penalty and one doesn't. Kentucky, which has it, West Virginia, which doesn't. Very similar states, no real difference in the murder rate. Nebraska, Iowa, very similar states. Nebraska has a death penalty, Iowa does not. No significant difference in the murder rates. Indiana has a death penalty. Illinois had it, repealed it several years ago. Michigan has no death penalty. Very similar states. Almost identical murder rates. On the micro level, I can tell you, like I said, I've been doing this work for 39 years. I have represented dozens of people charged with murder. I've never had a conversation with any of them in which there was any indication that what the maximum penalty would be, whether death or life in prison, factored into their decision-making. And sometimes decision-making in some of these cases is a term you have to use advisedly. Generally, people who commit murder are of 2 minds. Number 1, they think they're too smart to get caught. Or number 2, they're so inflamed, so outraged, so under the influence of mental illness or whatever it is, they're not thinking about penalty. Ask yourself, can you imagine a person saying, gee, you know, I won't commit this murder because I might get the death penalty, but if I was only going to get life in prison, well, yeah, let's go. People don't think like that. People do not think like that. One other thing I should mention, in response to Officer Lorenzo talking about Massachusetts, it's interesting that of the major large industrial states, Massachusetts has the lowest murder rate by a wide margin. It's a non-death state. So, just thought I'd mention that. One other thing, I know I've talked longer than I should have, but there was also a reference of evolving standards of decency. The trend is very much away from the death penalty in America. As I mentioned, 7 states have eliminated it within the last 12 to 15 years. 4 others are under administrative moratorium. There are no more death prosecutions and no more executions until they completely re-examine their system. The last state to adopt the death penalty was Kansas in 1994. They've not executed anybody since then. The numbers of death verdicts that have been imposed nationwide, between 94 and 96, there were over 300 a year. In 2016, there were 31. So that's been cut by about 90%. Executions in the United States, from a high of 98 in 1999 to 20 in 2016, 23 in 2017. Finally, worldwide, 40 countries around the world have done away with the death penalty in the last 20 years. The United States is the only country in the Western Hemisphere that carries out executions. There are no countries in Europe that still have the death penalty, with the exception of Belarus. We are in the company, by carrying out multiple executions, of China, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, North Korea, and Somalia. One other thing, I don't want to presume to disagree with Justice Douglas. He mentioned Connecticut, where the courts have ruled that the abolition of the death penalty would apply retroactively. New Mexico, 9 years ago, abolished its death penalty prospectively only. The statute specifically did not affect retroactive people under death sentences, of which there were 2 and still are. Those 2 guys are still on death row, are still litigating, could still be put to death. So it's not an automatic that non-retroactive repeal would provide relief to people on death row. One other fact, I know I said that before. One other fact. There are currently 33 people on death row in Kentucky. 21 of them have been there for 20 years or more. It doesn't move quickly. It's not cheap. It's not practical. It's, as has been mentioned, there are very narrow circumstances. Murder of a police officer, probation officer, I think judge, murder in the course of a sexual assault, murder for hire, contract killing, and what's the other one? I believe it's murder in course, kidnapping? Home invasion. Or home invasion, right. Well, that's not true here, and it's not true. It is a potential aggravating factor in Kentucky that you had a prior capital conviction. I don't know of anywhere where 3 prior felony convictions is an aggravator. That doesn't mean it's not the case somewhere. It could be. I know there are a lot of 3 strikes rules that say you can get life in prison for what would ordinarily not be a life in prison offense if you've had 3 prior felonies. When California adopted that, they weren't even all required to be felonies. It was your 3rd offense. And they have had all kinds of problems with people being sentenced to life for a misdemeanor theft if they've had, 2 prior felonies. There was one guy who carried away a slice of pizza from a table that wasn't his and was sentenced to life for it because of his prior record. But no, as far as a capital aggravator, oh sure, Senator, that was one of the primary reasons why Illinois did away with their death penalty. There was a whole subunit of a suspect or even a target and sweat that individual until they got a confession. There were instances where they were applying electric shock and other forms of physical torture. And that was a major scandal. It's interesting. I don't know for a fact. My understanding is that they haven't set up a protocol yet. There is no death chamber. There is no death row. I think Mr. Addison's in population, although don't quote me on that. I'm not sure. But there is no facility in New Hampshire, and I don't believe, somebody can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe there's a protocol yet for conducting an execution. So that's something that I've seen, and again, I'm sure somebody else will testify that knows more about it than I do, but there was a projected cost of $1 million something just to set up an execution chamber. Thank you all.
The chair will call Senator Philip Clark.
Thank you very much, Senator Carson and members of the committee. For the record, I'm Senator Martha Fuller Clark. I represent District 21, which is the city of Portsmouth and 6 surrounding seacoast inland communities that consist of Newfields, Newmarket, Newington, Lee, Madbury, and Durham. And I appear before you today in strong support of the pending legislation. I have the number. Here it is. Which is Senate Bill 593FN, relative to the penalty for capital murder and changing the penalty to life imprisonment without the possibility for parole. Today you are going to hear many compelling reasons as to why we should repeal the death penalty in New Hampshire. I would like to speak to just 3 of them. The first reason, the United States currently aligns itself. You have heard these countries include Afghanistan. To my mind, it's an embarrassment and a disgrace to have our state, as well as our country, included in this particular list of countries globally. It is time that this state and eventually our country should join every other civilized country in the world and agree to abolish the death penalty. We're not saying that people who commit murder should not be punished, but there is no reason not to look at life imprisonment as a rational and appropriate alternative. It's under my understanding that with regard to New Hampshire, that we continue to have hanging on the books as a way to address the death penalty in New Hampshire, and we have never set up any of the mechanisms that are needed to be able to implement death penalty by injection. This is in response to Senator French's question, so that we could end up, I think, taking a form of capital punishment that is adherent to all of us, but frankly, capital punishment in terms of the death penalty is adherent to more than 60% of people in this country. It's time to abolish the death penalty, even if it could be administered fairly and flawlessly. But we know that the capital punishment system throughout our country has been far from fair or flawless. This is the second reason that New Hampshire should repeal the death penalty. A disproportionate number of people on death row throughout the country are black or mentally ill or both, and virtually all of them are poor. This is even true in New Hampshire with its single death row resident. Since 1976, the United States has executed 1,195 of its own citizens. During the same period, 161 people have been released from death row, some because the state cheated when it prosecuted them, but most because they were later determined to be actually innocent. How many people did the United States put to death that were actually innocent? There's no way for us to know that, and I'm not saying that that's what would happen in New Hampshire. But frankly, we need to make sure that we're not in a position where that could happen in this state. So there's only one way to guarantee that New Hampshire will never execute an innocent person, and that is to abolish the death penalty. Third, our capital murder statutes create two classes of victims, and I believe that this is also wrong. It is wrong to impose the death penalty depending on the status of the victim. Judges and prosecutors, yes, they are very important. They contribute greatly to the welfare of the state, and their lives should be valued. But school teachers and doctors and nurses are equally important. It is true that policemen put themselves in harm's way to protect our citizens, but so do firefighters. It is simply wrong to value one life above another. I have heard people say New Hampshire needs a death penalty for the most heinous crimes. But for each murder victim family member, the death of his or her loved one is the most heinous crime. It is unseemly to suggest that to a family member that his or her loved one wasn't important enough or his murder wasn't heinous enough to warrant the ultimate punishment. New Hampshire's death penalty creates a hierarchy of victims. It pits one victim against another, and in so doing, it diminishes the value of life of all of us. So I'm here today to say to you that it is time that we should abolish the death penalty in New Hampshire. We have had this debate in the past, and unfortunately, while it has been passed out of the House and the Senate, it has failed in the governor's office. I'm concerned, yes, that it could fail in the governor's office again, but that is no reason for us to not move forward and state, with great conviction that this is not what we want to be happening in New Hampshire, and we need to fight, and we need to send the message to the governor that this is no longer an acceptable. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity of coming in today. My name is Paul Lutz, and I am a former police officer. I've retired. I retired as a lieutenant from the Derry Police Department. I'm here today to testify in favor of this bill, and I'm also affiliated with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. On its face is a deterrent. We talk about deterrence consistently on this, but when it's been touched upon briefly, but as a deterrent to murder, the death penalty fails on the most basic tenets of social behavior, and that is that the potential offender doesn't consider the gravity of the punishment, but he does consider whether he's apprehended or not. He fears apprehension. Criminals take much more time, effort, and deliberation to not be caught. They feel that they're smart enough not to be caught. if you feel that that is the case. If, without qualification, people that commit crimes fall into that category, you have to consider that the first priority of the offender is to avoid apprehension. Consequently, the greatest resources of police should go towards successful apprehension. Now, we talk a lot about the price, and that's all over the place, the price of, or the cost of execution, or the cost of sentencing and successful prosecution of a suspect in a capital murder trial. Taking the $4.9 million on its face, and that's growing as we sit here, if we were to take that amount of money, and we're a state with limited resources, if we were to take that amount of money and allocate it for programs, for crime prevention, for enforcement, and give that out proportionately based upon population to police departments throughout the state, the grants and the amount of money that would be realized by departments would be phenomenal. For instance, the city of Manchester would receive almost $500,000. Concord, $165,000. Communities like Derry, Salem, Dover, Portsmouth, about $125,000. That's not factoring in the projected $1.7 million that it would cost to build a death chamber, a death facility to carry out that sentence. As far as representing police, we hear from a lot of organizations that represent that organization. I can tell you with a great degree of certainty, sitting right here, that there are anecdotally numbers of police officers that are opposed to the death penalty, some because of a moral issue, and some because they just recognize that it just doesn't work, that it's a waste of resources that can be better used in other places. The other issue was the justice, and I'm glad somebody on the committee brought up the justice versus the cost. It's interesting that back in 1971, the Nixon administration commissioned a study to be done to comprehensively look at the entire criminal justice process. And it was reduced to a report entitled The National Strategy to Reduce Crime. That report, which was voluminous, had one paragraph with respect to capital punishment. And what they said is that with all of the mitigating factors that were taken into consideration in various states, including mental capacity, maturity, coercion, on and on and on, the only possible way that the death penalty could be justifiably and evenly meted out would be the opposition or the abolishment of the death penalty, or automatic sentencing to death upon whatever sentence or whatever crime the person is charged. And they stated that we submit that no one has the stomach for that, and certainly would not be something that would be probably constitutional. We also hear about the fact that one of the reasons, I've spoken to several representatives, and one of the reasons that they're in favor of the death penalty is for the protection of police officers. I will tell you that since I started my career over 45 years ago, and as I said, I've since retired, but in that amount of time, I have never seen a bill before this body that proposed enhanced penalty for assault on a police officer. It was a joke. It was save $25 up and punch a cop. And it happened all the time. We talk about the death penalty on an incident where we've had very, very few incidents where it's been perpetrated under the definition of capital murder now, but back to the resources again, We have police officers that are going out on retirement, disability, workers' compensation, departments that are incurring costs of hiring people to replace those that have been injured in assaults. The two don't square. They just don't. I will say, just in closing, that I've attended a number of dozens, unfortunately, of officers' funerals who were killed in the line of duty in this state and others. I know that you feel I'm retired and I have no skin in the game. I will tell you that my son, my only child, is a police officer, full-time police officer in this state. And although I don't dwell upon it, occasionally the unthinkable comes into my mind. And I know that despite contemplating that, I still stand solid in my resolve in knowing that the death penalty is a bad deal for this state and of all citizens. I have some handouts here with some statistics for the members of the committee.
Thank you. Would be happy to have. Thank you.
Should I go ahead? So, good afternoon. I'm the chair of the New Hampshire Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. For 30 years, I was a lawyer in the criminal justice system here in the state. I was a homicide prosecutor with the Attorney General's office. I was a homicide representative as a member of the Public Defender's office. I've been retired for many, many years, but I feel so strongly about the death penalty that I continue to serve on the coalition and continue to serve as its chair. The coalition is a group of about 15 or so organizations, ranging from religious organizations like the Episcopal Church, Diocese, the Catholic Diocese, the Council of Churches, to civic organizations like the League of Women Voters, the NAACP, and to social justice institutions like the New Hampshire Civil Liberties Union and the American Friends Service Committee. So as I speak to you here today, I'm mindful of the constituency that I'm trying to serve, probably tens of thousands of New Hampshire citizens who are concerned about this issue. I'm just going to tell you one story that will solidify, that will tell you, I hope, convince you that New Hampshire should not have the death penalty. I came to the belief that we shouldn't have the death penalty, actually as a prosecutor, because a good prosecutor will tell you that we value all human life. I represented people who had, or the families of people, or the state in situations where people had been murdered. They weren't always model citizens, I have to tell you. And sometimes they put themselves in harm's way. And we were taught, and I firmly believe that it was not our job to judge their life. It was our job to respect them and to advocate as strongly as we could in court for justice for them. And I couldn't square that with advocating ever to put someone to death as a prosecutor. I simply could not do that. And you actually talked about a case that I think what you might have been talking about was the Johnson case many, many years ago. It was a murder for hire case. Mr. Johnson hired 2 kids to kill his wife, and I would be happy to talk to you about that case anytime, Senator French. I was in the office when that case was filed, and it's the reason that I left the Attorney General's office, which is a place I thought I would spend my career in, but I left. But the case that solidified for me
that we should not have the death penalty in this country, in this state, in this world, is the case of Richard Buchanan. And I want to tell you the story about Richard Buchanan. I was a public defender at that time in 1997, I believe it was. And it was right before the July 4th weekend, and there was a big barbecue down in Kentucky, in this little apartment building in Kentucky. And among the people at this party was Richard Buchanan, his live-in girlfriend, Ruth Knapp, and their children. There was a lot of drinking at this party, it was a good time was had by all, let's just put it like that. To go into bed, and the next day, Richard goes to work. Richard Buchanan gets up, watches Judge Judy, which he did every morning, and went to work. Ruth Knapp went to wake up her daughter, her 6-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, and Elizabeth wouldn't wake up. And she realized that something was very, very wrong. She called the police came, and they found that this little girl had been raped and murdered the night before, after this big barbecue party. The police looked around the apartment. I was actually in that apartment when I was assigned to represent Richard, and I saw lots of pictures of it. And the whole apartment was probably the size of this room. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living room. And I will tell you, it was strewn from every single inch, was either had a kid's toy on it, or ashtrays, or beer cans. It was a mess all across that room. And the police quickly came to the realization, or the thought, the belief, that no one could have entered into that apartment and gone through all this junk and gone into this child's bedroom and raped and murdered her during that night. It had to be someone who was inside that apartment. The other thing is that Elizabeth was sleeping right next to her sister. I mean, literally, her sister was a little bit younger, a couple of years younger, but they could literally reach each other, hold hands in the beds. They were so close. It didn't make any sense to think that anyone else could have come into that house and did what they did to Elizabeth. The police spoke for hours to the mother, Ruth Knapp, and Ruth kept insisting that she was in bed asleep that night. She didn't know what happened to her child. She hadn't heard anything. She did not know what happened. But the police kept after her and after her and after her. They were of the belief that she had to know something. After all, in their mind, she was sleeping next to the man who had done this. And they finally, her statement was videotaped, so you could see this, and you could see the moment when the police said to her, "Look, your daughter was raped and murdered. If either you or Richard did this, tell us what happened." At that point, this poor woman started to squeal, literally squeal. And she said, "All right, I'll tell you, I saw Richard do this." So they got an eyewitness now to what they believe is the rape and murder of this child. She didn't see Richard do this because he didn't. I have to tell you, I mean, I went into that house, I saw everything. In my mind, I'm thinking, boy, it sure looks like he did this. When they asked Richard about it, when they picked him up that day, and they said, "Did you rape and murder Elizabeth Knapp?" What he said was, "Oh, I was pretty drunk last night, but that doesn't sound like anything I would do." That was his big defense. So I'm thinking I'm going to have a real problem with this case. What happened is that someone had come down, the upstairs neighbor had come into that house and had raped that little girl. And how do we know this? because fortunately, that man, James Dale, did not wear a condom, and he left DNA and he left semen in that little girl. This is the first DNA case I had ever worked on back in 1997. When the results of the DNA test came back in, I couldn't even believe it. And I called my own expert and I said, what does this mean? What does this mean? And the DNA expert said, it means that your client is innocent. He did not leave this DNA. I've spoken to, Phil McLaughlin was the Attorney General at the time. Phil has testified on behalf of repeal of the death penalty, and partly what moved him was this case, because rape of death in the course of a sexual assault is included in our death penalty statute. And Phil was he was certainly contemplating and probably would have charged him with capital murder. So my client would have been facing a death penalty. I don't think that there's any doubt when there was a quote-unquote eyewitness to this that he would have been found guilty of capital murder. I think it's very likely that he would have been sentenced to death. And he came, as I like to say, the margin of error in that case was so small, it was virtually the size, literally the size of a condom. If James Dale had worn a condom, I say with high confidence, my client would have been dead. And it's not because people wanted to do the wrong thing. No one wanted the wrong person to be charged with this, to go to trial, to go to prison for this crime. No one wanted that. The police officers who interviewed Ruth Knapp were well-meaning people, but they had an idea of what happened, and that they led that interview to go that way. They didn't want to arrest the wrong person, but they would have. The prosecutors didn't want to charge the wrong person, but they would have, because that's where all the evidence would have been pointing. And I don't think a jury would have wanted to convict the wrong person, but I think the likelihood that they would have is very, very, very strong. It's the kind of thing that I still have nightmares about. For that reason alone, people say New Hampshire is exceptional. New Hampshire is exceptional, but no one in the criminal justice system, no one in this room is infallible. And as long as we have the death penalty, mistakes can be.
Tell me, what was James Dale's sentence for committing that murder?
I know. I don't think he was ultimately. I don't remember. You know, and I should, because I just read the case recently. I don't remember.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
I have some material that I'll pass out both from the coalition and my own.
Good afternoon. My name is Randy Steidle. I come from a small farming community in southern Illinois. From the age of 12, I'd always worked hard, and I played hard, but I'd never been in serious trouble with the law. In 1986, a friend of mine, Herbert Whitlock, and I were questioned about the murders of two newlyweds. Their names were Dyke and Karen Rose. I dismissed this as simply an attempt by police to question a number of people in the area. I didn't know either of the victims, but I cooperated fully with the police. I provided a corroborated alibi for the night of the murders. To my shock, Herbert Whitlock and I were arrested, tried, and convicted, and sentenced to death within 90 days. I had inadequate legal representation, and there was no DNA evidence against me. Witnesses fabricated testimony against me, due to misconduct by local police and prosecutors. I spent the next 12 years on death row trying to prove my innocence. Finally, in 1999, I was able to get a new sentencing hearing, which resulted in a sentence of life without parole. I continued to fight for my freedom for almost 5 more years. In 2000, an Illinois State Police investigation of 4 years proved that local police and prosecutors had framed me and Herbert, resulting in our wrongful convictions. The real person responsible for the murder was Karen Rhodes' employer, a man who had made major campaign contributions all the way to the governor of Illinois' office. This made the case too politically sensitive, so that the governor ordered the investigation against him to be ceased. In 2003, a federal judge overturned my conviction and ordered a new trial. Judge McCuskey stated that if all the evidence that should have been investigated had been presented at trial, it was reasonably probable that I would have been acquitted by the jury. The state reinvestigated the case, tested DNA evidence, and found no link to me. The state attorney general decided not to appeal the ruling, and county prosecutors decided not to retry the case. On May 28, 2004, after a total of 17 years, 3 months, 3 weeks of wrongful imprisonment, I left prison. I was escorted by my wife Patty, my mother Bobby, and my brother Rory, who was an Illinois State policeman for 25 years. My faith in God and the constant support of my family enabled me to be strong and not let the system turn me into what they think I am or wanted me to be while I was in prison. I was the 18th person to be freed because of a wrongful conviction after serving time on the state's death row since Illinois reinstated the death penalty in 1977. I can't make up for the more than 17 years I lost not being able to see my family outside of the confines of prison, not being able to watch my children grow up, not being able to be a productive member of society, all for something I didn't do, and all for political reasons. We've heard a lot about statistics today, but I am here to tell you that the people who have been exonerated and released from death rows across the United States aren't just statistics. They're human beings who had hopes and dreams, just like all Americans. Some of them are in this room with you today. I'm one of them. And I hope my story helps put a face on the statistics. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to my story today. Thank you.
The chair will call Ray Dodge.
Good afternoon. Thanks for your time. My name is Ray Dodge, and I've been here many times before, testifying before this committee and others. I was in law enforcement for 25 years, and I retired 12 years ago after being a police chief for 8 years. So I come to you today, as I have before, that I am in favor of this bill. I think that repealing the death penalty is necessary, and just a couple of reasons why, and I won't get into too much because you have my written testimony. You can read that at your leisure. It's much better with a cup of coffee than it is with my voice here today. But it doesn't work, and the reason it doesn't work is because in preparation for being on this issue, I mean, at one time I was in favor of the death penalty, as most police officers are. But as I worked the system and as I could see the failings in it, and realizing that I'm a human being just like everybody else, as much as I'd like to think that I went 25 years without making a mistake, you could spend 2 minutes in each community that I work and you will find no problem finding people that would tell you that I did. And they were right. But it doesn't work because, so in preparation I've done a lot of study. And one of the things that I found that was quite interesting, because you hear study after study after study shows that it works, and study after study after study shows that it doesn't work. And the interesting thing is most studies are actually inconclusive as to whether the death penalty works or it doesn't work. And I think there's a reason for that. And I would like to maybe piggyback a little on the gentleman from the Public Defender's Office who sat here and testified to you about the differences between states that have the death penalty and do not have the death penalty and homicide rates. The reason why I think most of those studies are inconclusive is because there are so many variables that go into why somebody does commit a crime or why somebody does not commit a crime. And to try to narrow that down to one issue, I just think we're fooling ourselves. So, and I certainly, I look at the death penalty and I say to myself, well, I don't want to be killed, so of course that deters me. I don't want to steal somebody else's property. I don't want to burglarize anybody else's property. So that works for me, but I'm not a criminal. Criminals, and you just heard testimony from another gentleman, how criminals don't think the way you and I do. If they did, in theory, they wouldn't be committing crimes. We wouldn't be sitting here today. So my major impetus, there are many, most of which in my testimony, but I wanted to point out today, I don't believe it works, and the reason I believe it doesn't work is because we just don't have any evidence that it does or it doesn't. So I think we're chasing money in the wrong direction, which takes me to my second point, which is cost. And I think one of the things that we need to think about when we're talking about saving money, I think that's the wrong approach. I think what we should be talking about is prioritization. What do we do with this money that we are spending, at least on one case in this particular circumstance that we're talking about? One of the things, of course, I was involved in for years was budget. And it always amazed me how much I would have to haggle over getting sufficient budget money for either for gasoline or for buying cars and training. And one of the things that has sort of piqued my interest now because of the recent wave of what we're seeing, the advent, I think, of smartphones and cameras has maybe put a light on this and exposed it a little bit. But when you go on YouTube, there's just no shortage of police officers making wrong decisions. And I think when you look at most of those videos, the conclusion, at least I come to, is most of them were not properly trained. I think we trained to minimum standards. Maybe in some cases we might train beyond that, but at least it was my experience. We have a minimum standard. Let's train to the minimum standard. Well, if I teach you how to drive a stick shift, Volkswagen, and you get pretty proficient at it, and then you go to Europe and you hop in a Formula One race car and you crash and burn on the first turn, and you come back to me and say, you didn't, what happened? And my response is, I didn't train you to drive a Formula One race car. I trained you to drive a stick shift Volkswagen. And I think that's the analogy that I'm trying to make here is if we're going to be talking about savings and cost, then I think we also need to be talking about should that money go. And I would advocate to you that I think you need to be looking at training and equipping our police departments. If that's what you really want to do is make the police officers safer out there. I mean, let's look at without going into great detail, the Greenland shooting. When I read that report a few years ago, it was a stark what jumped off the page at me was the lack of communication, and I don't mean physical communication. They didn't have radios at that scene that were on the same frequency, so the back could not communicate with the front. You had officers that were there that were not trained for that kind of a situation. Not their fault. They were called to go there and had to do something. And equipment, lack of equipment. So I really think that's where the focus needs to be with our money, which means prioritization, which means we just got to be reasonable about this. I think that's one of the things about this is definitely an emotional issue. I get that. I understand why that can be, but I think we really got to interject some reason into this process. Just a quick to wrap this up. One of the things I did in my study here a few years ago was the cost to maintain a prisoner in New Hampshire. So I researched, I got some numbers. I apologize, they're a few years old because this bill I didn't know was filed until I heard about it last week, and I just, unfortunately my life goes on and I just had other priorities. But at the time, I got my information from the Department of Justice, the Department of Corrections, and from the Public Defender's Office. We at that time spent about $38,000 a year to house an inmate at the state prison. That's the cost. When you look at so now if you're going to try to figure out what is the cost of housing a prisoner for the lifetime of that prisoner, what I did is I did some research and established that the average age of an individual that goes onto death row is 29 years old. So then you take the average life expectancy, and that's usually a male. So then you take the average life expectancy of that male, and it comes out to about age 77. So then when you factor in the average appeal process is about 15 years, you're talking, first of all, the average, given that 29 to 77, we're going to spend about $1.4 to $1.5 million just to house that with a $38,000 a year price tag. So when you factor in appeals, the average appeal is 15 years, so now you're about to age 44. So what you're really talking about is at age 44 to age 77 sector is what you really would be saving. It's certainly far less than the 1.4, and it's certainly way less than the 4.82 million I heard on the defense alone earlier. So there is a cost savings there. And again, back to my original point, I don't really think we should be talking about cost. I really think we should be talking about priorities. I'll end it there. You have my testimony, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony this afternoon. Are there any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
For the record, Madam Chairwoman and members of the committee, I am Gregory Smith, and I served for nearly 12 years in the Attorney General's office and 4.5 years as the Attorney General of New Hampshire. I have had the responsibility for the kinds of cases that you are considering. I think the testimony of the witnesses, in my judgment, is compelling. I won't repeat any of it, but I agree with virtually all of it. It is, I think, the hard evidence that leads inescapably to the conclusion that the death penalty does not work. It doesn't serve the purposes that we ascribe to it. It's not a deterrent. And the reason that I decided, having had a responsibility to carry this kind of authority out, to appear, I think the first time might have been 2013 or 14 that I appeared before you, and say that I oppose the continuation of the use of the death penalty is that it is plain to me that even people of indisputable goodwill and competence, human beings as they are unable to carry out a system that engages the state in killing people in a way that is going to be consistently fair and just to everyone who falls within the purview of that statute. We know that's the case. We know that over 100 people who had been convicted and sentenced to stay on death row were subsequently found innocent. There can be little doubt that in our history we have executed innocent people. We can make mistakes in criminal prosecution, but in all other cases, with the due process to which we're entitled, anyone who's been convicted will have the right to bring forward testimony and gain the vindication they deserve if there has been an error in their case. But someone who's been put to death, there's a permanency in that case that means that we have no capability to correct the injustice. Not to mention the people who've spent decades on death row for something they didn't do, which must be a particularly significant kind of horror. So when I look at the evidence, it is clear that the sequence of judgments, which is inherent in every single case, that police have to decide what crime to charge, the prosecutor has to decide what crime to prosecute. Jurors will sit on the case, and what we will have is variation. Inevitably, we've seen it between the people who hold the ultimate responsibility to prosecute, the Attorney General. We've had Attorneys General in our recent 40 or 50 years who have had these cases before them and have made different judgments about whether death would be sought or not. I've had those kinds of cases. We will have jurors who, uniquely to this kind of a case, are charged with setting this penalty of death or life without parole. All other cases involve an experienced judge who sees cases day in and day out to decide how to impose a sentence. These cases draw 12 jurors who have never done that before in their lives, who will hear the case and have to decide whether it will be death or life in prison without parole. And each defendant will have a different group of 12 new jurors. When we look at the statistics, we see not only that there are people who were innocent who've been convicted, but it is indisputable that the death penalty, rare as it is, falls in disproportionately on people who are different racially or ethnically or economically, or poor. There are 30 or 40,000 homicides in the United States in a year, and we select 100 of those people to be put into this kind of a process. It can't be a fair and just system, because we know that there isn't a kind of stratification of the seriousness or the heinousness of the crime that we think there is. All these victims have suffered the worst kind of heinous violence. All these victims' families are suffering that. And as long as these cases drag on, they continue to have that open suffering. They never really get closure. We're going through an exercise in a very select few cases, distorted as it is in its application, which cannot claim the name justice. So it's for that reason that I decided that I wanted to speak up and say that we should join the trend in the civilized part of the world to which we have belonged for over 2,000 years, is moving away from this idea that our government should be engaged in this exercise, which inevitably will be flawed, of putting just a very few people to death, and that it's actually accomplishing any just purpose. Others won't do it, which includes specific deterrence. The Constitution says that is to reform mankind. So, and to punish. But punish doesn't mean retribution. We do have those legitimate purposes, and when we look as we can with so much information at our disposal, we know that life without parole achieves the purpose of specific and general deterrence as much as the death penalty can. There's no evidence that the death penalty somehow is taken into account by people who are going to commit these crimes, and fewer of them are committed because they think they have the risk of the death penalty. It just isn't the case. And life without parole serves the purposes far better. No one who's been sentenced to life without parole in New Hampshire, to my knowledge, has ever been released. Their crime rate is near zero. They are some of the most responsible people in the prison who help maintain the prison environment. And that served in a humane society, in a wise society, the purposes of justice fully. And I cannot speak for victims. They speak eloquently for themselves. But what I've heard about what they say is the protracted period of going through this expensive death penalty process, which is inevitable because we are guaranteed, constitutionally guaranteed due process, just keeps this pain alive for them. And when an execution occurs, they don't get some kind of closure. It's a great wound and it's very hard to deal with, but this isn't the best way to even look out for our victims. And I, like witnesses before, don't think there's some kind of hierarchy we should try to identify between victims. I was there when the statute was adopted in the 1970s, when Warren Rudd was Attorney General, and there were only 3 categories, and now we've added 3 or 4 more. There really isn't any proper distinction between those crimes and other terrible homicides. But we're deluding ourselves, I think, in thinking that we've found some that are worse and that we will consistently impose a more severe penalty on those few that we correctly identified as deserving it. I just think it falls. It fails. It doesn't happen. And don't forget that we haven't executed anyone since 1939. We're approaching a century. And all the cases that qualified for the death penalty, and there are many of them over that period of time, many of them in the time that I had experience, those people were not convicted and sentenced to death. So how is it that we can be comfortable that there's only going to be 1 or 2 in a century? It just doesn't meet any standard of justice in my view. I have something I'd like to leave with the committee.
Please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman.
The chair will call Julia Rodriguez. I'd also like to remind everyone, it is almost 3 o'clock, and there are a number of people left who would like to speak, so please do not read testimony and do not repeat what we've already said. Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Rodriguez.
Hi.
Thank you for waiting very patiently.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me to testify. My name is Julia Rodriguez. I live in Durham. I am actually going to speak from the perspective of the victims and the sister of a victim of violent crime. My brother was among the many thousands who were killed on September 11th, 2001. My brother Greg Rodriguez, who worked in the North Tower at the World Trade Center. And the last 16 and a half years have, as all of you can probably imagine, been very devastating to my family and to me. My parents obviously, lost their son. I lost my only sibling. Greg was 2 years younger than me. We were very close. My 2 daughters, who were born in 2002 and 2006, will never meet my brother. And all of that was compounded by the public nature, the fact that so many people lost their lives on that day, etc. All that said, I am testifying in favor of this bill because I strongly believe that the death penalty is not the solution for victims, or at least speaking for myself. I can't speak for others. But now, having lived through this almost unimaginable, unfathomable loss in the context of what was essentially mass murder, sort of compounding the shock and the horror, I've concluded that not only is capital punishment more harmful to me as a victim, but it also does not make sense societally. So I'll just say a few words about both of those rationales. First of all, as Mr. Smith mentioned, the prolonged nature of capital cases is really traumatizing for families. Of course, we seek justice and closure, but the decade-long, expensive, sometimes very high-profile proceedings kind of keep us in the trauma over and over again in a way that life sentence without parole or another appropriate sentence would bring at least legal closure to having to deal with the crime. Obviously, the personal process goes on forever, but these accentuating factors can be longer or shorter. And capital crimes, since they do, stand on shaky constitutional grounds, that's why these processes go on so long, almost inevitably end up prolonging the trauma for victims and families. The second reason, the societal impact, a lot of that has already been addressed, so I won't repeat it, but there is, I do want to say that as a citizen and one who has experienced a loss at the hands of violent criminals, I have never once sought the state-sanctioned execution of the people who did 9/11. There are 5 of them right now accused, in fact, so not all the people, who were implicated in that event died on that day in the planes, but there are other people. One man who actually is in prison right now for being part of the conspiracy, and then 5 others who are in Guantanamo. The thought that my government would kill somebody for killing just sends my head into a tailspin. it doesn't make sense, and to be honest, it would bring back a lot of horrible feelings of the loss of life. So, that I think it also is a societal reason, but I have this insight as a victim living through it year after year, that knowing that the horrible loss of my brother could be compounded by state-sanctioned killing and repeating the cycle of violence without true justice, which can be achieved in other ways, as other testimony has explained. That to me is just a huge number of reasons to vote for this bill. And I'll just end by saying that I really feel as a citizen of the state of New Hampshire, I want to live in a state that joins our other New England states, and in addition to all of New England, 15 other states who have recognized all of the drawbacks and...
Robin Nafshi, did I get that correct?
Rabbi.
I know sometimes it's
Rebbe's good Yiddish.
Okay.
Good afternoon, and thank you for taking my testimony. My name is Rabbi Robin Nafshi. I'm the rabbi here of Temple Beth Jacob in Concord. I'm here to testify in favor of Senate Bill 593, and I'm going to offer a few thoughts. There are many people who seek justification of the death penalty because of biblical examples. We know in what is generally referred to as the Old Testament, what the Jews call the Hebrew Bible, there are 21 different scenarios under which the death penalty was supposedly imposed. And yet, if we look at the text itself, we see that there are no actual applications of the death penalty. It's more theoretical. And the later rabbis who would come to interpret this text, in fact, believed that perhaps only once, more likely never, was the death penalty actually imposed. And they even created a standard that made it virtually impossible. And that is that a witness saw an individual who was about to commit a crime for which the punishment would be death. The witness warns the individual not to go ahead. The individual goes ahead and commits the crime, and then there are at least a minimum of 2 witnesses who see the commission of the crime. So obviously they have created a standard virtually impossible. And their hope was that, in fact, the death penalty would never be imposed. And Jews, like other religious people, may have differing opinions within our own community. And yet, within the Jewish world, there are 4 denominations of Jews: Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and Reconstructionist. And we are unanimous in our opposition to the death penalty. And believe me, to get a whole bunch of Jews to agree on anything is virtually impossible. But it is our sense that, as has been said before, humans make mistakes. There's only one being in our world that is infallible, and that is God, and we do not get to play God. That, again, no deterrent has ever shown, or no evidence has shown that there is deterrence, and that all human beings possess the possibility of repentance. I have to say, one of the things I do as a rabbi is I actually visit with an inmate. Actually, once a month I go to the men's prison, and once a month I go to the women's prison. And there is a Jewish woman in Goffstown who was convicted of murder. And you would not meet a person filled with more repentance for what she has done and the horrors. And and if she could roll her life back and the clock back to that time, she knows she would make a different choice. That is what we seek in human beings. We seek that possibility, the possibility of growth and repentance, and to take that away from somebody through their execution, in my mind, is a wrong thing for the government to do. We look at the nation of Israel. Israel is actually the only nation in the world that lives by both democratic principles and biblical principles. And Israel has executed one person in its entire history. It was not Yigdal Amir who assassinated Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. It has not been any of the terrorists who have blown up cafes and coffee houses and pizza restaurants. No, it was Adolf Eichmann following the war crime trials. And as heinous as a murder may be in New Hampshire, I would implore you not to sully the memory of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust by justifying and equating the death penalty in our state with the murder of Nazis. Or killing in our state with the murder of Nazis. Earlier testimony talked about an eye for an eye. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is not a biblical injunction or raising a possibility of killing someone, taking their life because a life was taken by them. It sets up an economic system. And the rabbis again recognize that how ridiculous is it if I accidentally hit someone and their eye comes out, that the punishment be for me that my eye is removed. It continues, as has been said before, this horrific cycle of violence. And it goes down to, as well as, a life for a life. And so they want people to think about the seriousness of what they do in their actions and how it should feel as if you have lost the limb or the life or the eye or anything else that was recognized, but it is mentioned simply as an economic the way we punish a person is to recognize it as an economic imposition, and that we have to, it's no different than really in tort law when we have to try and come up with what the value of something is. So the last thing I would say is that we have talked about nations in which, as has been mentioned, nations in which the death penalty remains. But let's think of it from the opposite perspective. And these are nations that have been predominantly Christian nations, or have been the official religion of these nations as Christianity. And the followings of those nations have all outlawed the death penalty. Andorra in 1990, Argentina in 2008, Costa Rica in 1877, Denmark in 1933, Dominican Republic in 66, Finland in 49, the Republic of Georgia in 97, Greece in 93, Haiti in 87, Honduras in 56, Iceland 1928, Italy 1947, Liechtenstein 87, Malta 71, Monaco 62, Norway 1905, Paraguay 92, Poland 1997, Portugal 1867, Slovenia 1989, Spain in 1978, and Switzerland in 1942. And I would invite us to bring New Hampshire in with those countries, in with the rest of the states of New England, and help move the United States into that list of other civilized nations that have done away with the death penalty. A more expanded version of my testimony.
Thank you. Well, we will take the time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee.
Oh, no, please go on.
Okay.
This is our clerk, Tammy Wright, so I just need to speak with her about what's going on.
Yeah, that's fine. Ditto to much of what you've heard. I'm here to support this bill, and many of the points that I would make myself have already been made, so I will just talk from the point of view of someone who has worked for decades in the movement and violence against women and worked with victims of crime. I would ask you to remember what Ms. Rodriguez said about her own experience as a crime victim, and saying that she can't speak for all crime victims, only for herself. But what she expressed is what, over the decades that I've worked with crime victims, I have heard from them. I was the executive director of the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence for 30 years. I'm not here speaking for them, I'm here speaking for myself, but I still do a lot of consulting work in that field, and I'm on the board of directors of organizations that work with crime victims. Crime victims in general are looking for closure and healing. They want support, they want to move on, they want to know what they need to do to move on. They're not generally looking for retribution. I think that the death penalty does harm to crime victims. You've heard about the lack of closure and the many years of trials and families of murder victims having to live with that for a long time. I don't think that's helpful to victims. And I also want to, that also connects to the question that you asked Senator French about, is this about justice or about money? I think it's about both. And when you spend so much money on death penalty cases that other parts of the criminal justice system don't get the funding that they need for important things like police training, prevention programs, then you are talking about justice too, because you're impeding justice by funding an ineffective part of the criminal justice system and therefore taking funds away. One organization I'm involved with does a lot of research around prevention programs to prevent sexual assault on college campuses and in high schools. And we all know that's a problem that's gotten a lot of attention in the last several years. Given that we have research-proven prevention programs that can help end sexual violence, that need funding, to watch the amount of money that goes to death penalty cases and think about shifting that money into prevention programs that could have us as a society end up with fewer victims, it makes no sense to me. So again, ditto to much of what you've already heard. Thank you for listening to all this testimony.
Thank you. My name is Jason Wells. I am the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Council of Churches. This council is an ecumenical Christian body that is made up of 9 denominations in the state of New Hampshire. Those denominations are the American Baptist Church, the Episcopal Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Society of Friends, often called the Quakers, Greek Orthodox, Presbyterian Church USA, the United Church of Christ, the United Methodist Church, and the Unitarian Universalist Church. You'll pardon me if I read my testimony when I recite that list. All 9 of these denominations, much as Rabbi Robin had said earlier, denominations of religious bodies do not come to agreement often. It is rare that I can come and offer testimony because we so frequently disagree in our diversity. But this is a place where I can come testify because all 9 of these denominations in the state of New Hampshire are in agreement that the death penalty should be repealed. This is something that each of these denominations has arrived at on their own and independently, but also through the Council of Churches they have a united statement and testimony which I can distribute to you later. To summarize that sort of faith and the conscience commitment that about 1 in 3 Granite Staters most likely has is in 3 steps. Some have already taken my 4th step on cycles of violence, and I won't repeat that testimony. But those 3 steps I see as, first of all, recognizing the sacredness of all human life, that the book of Genesis tells Christians that God created human beings in God's own image and likeness, that the sacredness of human life is a gift. And each of those denominations says in some form of wording something along the lines that the intentional taking of a human life is always wrong, and that Christians see the death penalty as the intentional taking of a human life, something that can be seen as always wrong. Another faith commitment that Christians share among themselves is our fallibility. A number of folks have pointed out that fallibility in terms of ways in which testimony is coerced, evidences are tampered, limited scientific understandings, forensic science later shows past judgments to have been wrong, that we are fallible creatures who make mistakes. And there are ways that we set up systems to reduce errors and eliminate mistakes, but when it comes to the choices of life and death, when it comes to the choice of taking a human life intentionally, there can be no mistakes. It is a decision which is in the clear wrong versus the right. It always violates the sacred gift of human life. The third and final faith commitment that I'll offer to you that many Granite Staters share is that every human person is also capable of rehabilitation. I think rehabilitation is something that has been brought up already as part of the criminal justice system, but it is something that is a core Christian commitment that a person can come to conversion, repentance, and rehabilitation. And that applies equally to every person. Sometimes within the realm of talking about the death penalty, I do hear people offer the opinion that there are some people who cannot be rehabilitated, that there are some people who will always be wrong and our world should be without those people. That is a position which cannot be classified as Christian. Every single person is capable of that rehabilitation, and to offer the death penalty is to say that a person cannot be rehabilitated, that God cannot reach that person, and that our decision-making process knows that person better than their divine creator. So these are 3 commitments about the sacredness of human life and the taking of it intentionally, about our basic fallibility and that we cannot apply fallible decision-making to this kind of question, and that every person is capable of rehabilitation and conversion and redemption. And that is something that we cannot close off by applying the death penalty to someone. So these are just a few of the reasons why these 9 denominations, perhaps about 500,000 Granite Staters, would support the repeal of the death penalty. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to address and urge you to vote ought to pass on this bill. The Bishop Labashi of our Roman Catholic Diocese of Manchester cannot be here today, and I've been asked to speak on his behalf as well as offer my own thoughts. In the interest of time, we're submitting our written statements, but I would just like to add a couple of things that I haven't heard yet so far. One is that we read in the Gospel often that Jesus taught that when you do something to the least of my brothers, you do it to me. I submit to you that those convicted of the most heinous crimes are among those least of our brothers and sisters. So as Christians, we're asked to make judgment. What does that mean our society should be? Secondly, Christians around the world are observing Lent right now. And the tenet of our faith is that our Savior, our Redeemer, Jesus Christ, was himself executed for wrongful conviction. Thank you.
Did you call the Reverend Dale Avery?
Yes, I've already.
I'm sorry? He hadn't signed up, so come forward and please, I'll tell you what I asked everyone else. Please, don't read any testimony if you have it, and don't repeat anything we've already heard.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman. My name is Richard O'Leary. I serve the 13th District, Manchester Ward 6. I'm a member of the Judicial and Committee at the House here. I will be very short because I was listening to this just as you have, but there's a few things that have to be said. I had the greatest job in the world. I was a police officer for 33 years. I started off in Manchester, and I finished up 33 years later as a deputy chief in charge of detectives. I started off as a meter maid, tagging cars, but I spent 33 years. During that time, I knew Ralph Miller, and I knew Michael Briggs. Ralph was a younger guy. He came on earlier just as I did, when we didn't know what day it was. And Mike Briggs had been around for many years, and luckily he came to Manchester as a policeman. They were both outstanding policemen, and Ralph Miller's assassin got over 50 years in prison. He did not get the death penalty because it wasn't there at the time. Mike Briggs, his assassin was sentenced to death. What I can tell you, it has not been easy for either family. I am not going to sit here and speak to about the families and what their thoughts are, but I can't tell you how many funerals I went to or how many visits at the cemetery I was at for these two sharp individuals. Now I've heard, I'm obviously against the death penalty, and I am for this bill here. I think it's much needed and long overdue. I understand that there's a possibility of it being vetoed. Therefore, I hope we get the necessary votes to override that veto. A couple of the issues raised on that veto was protecting criminal victims. I don't know exactly what that means, but if it comes to determine about the death penalty, there's a lot of victims today that just assume not go through that long and lengthy procedure. It's so long, it takes 15 so many years just to bring it to the court system, and there's still no sign of ending for Mr. Briggs. The issue was doing this, the veto, for members of law enforcement. Well, I don't think that's a valid reason either, because I'm a member of law enforcement, as are many others that are against the death penalty. Unfortunately, when you work in an environment like a police department, they're all very tight, everybody's very tight, and that's the way it should be. But oftentimes, because of that, there's a lot of peer pressure involved. The peer pressure, unfortunately, puts some of the vocal people in a back seat, and they're not as vocal as it would be or hope they would be. There are many people that know my position on this, and a number of them have quietly come up to me and says, you know, it's a good job. Somebody's at least going out there and explaining about a veto on this there. And the other reason was, for the veto, is advocates for justice were interested, and that's why it is thought of. Now, over the course of my career, I have met many, many, many advocates for justice. And what they are looking for is justice. They are looking for a justice that is under the letter of the law. I don't know many of these folks that are advocates for justice that are looking to have anybody killed by the state of New Hampshire. So I'm not sure of those three reasons that were named for reasons for a veto. They really don't make sense for a lot of the people I know. Now, there are a lot of issues involved here. They have been covered. I have my notes here, and all I will do is just line by line mention a few of the things there. But some of the issues are the cost involved. The cost involved in an execution is enormous. I'd rather see that cost going towards police training. All we have to do is listen to the local news, and we're going to find stupidity on a policeman's part. I think more training is the key number one thing to make our officers much more professional, although they are professional at this time. The innocent people, how can we put somebody to death and then find out that they're innocent? The Innocent Project has at least 150 saved souls that they have saved. There's a number of other ones that have been executed that we know factually were not guilty. A gentleman spoke about somebody in Texas for arson. That is probably the biggest red light about anybody being set to death for an arson conviction. Granted, there were 3 or 4 people passed away in that, but the gentleman was put to death, did not create an arson. And it has since been proven that it is not an arson. We talk about race. As you review statistics and so forth, the black male is always the one that seems to be convicted, where the white male doesn't get his chance. It's not an even set of justice standards. And the victims has changed over the years. Normally in the beginning it had been revenge and retribution. More so the case now is healing, mercy, and forgiveness. To wait all these long years, 16, 15, 20 years for a closing of their case, that's a long time, and that's difficult. And the South has the highest murder rate. They also have the highest conviction and execution rate, 80%. Northeast, the lowest rate, 1% of all executions. And I've listened to some of the comments here, and there's a few that are very, very good. I'm not going to recite those or anything else. I guess my last thing I would tell you is there was a good state senator who we all know, and unfortunately he just passed away. I remember the last time I testified, speaking to him to get the lay of the land, to see what the feelings were and so forth. And I asked him where he stood. This state senator, I'm sure you all know who I mean, was a very good guy. His short and sweet answer was, how will I explain killing to someone? How will I explain this to the grandchildren that I'm for killing a human being? And that was his message. So I'm not going to, I have a few other things I could say, but in my career over 33 years, I don't see where the death penalty does any good. It does not do anything to protect police officers. You train them better, and they'll be more protected. My son is a policeman in Manchester, and he was up here, and he was more interested in what the state legislature was going to do about extra jobs. My son was up here, and he was wondering, are they going to tack on more years of service? He has to do 25 years instead of what I had to do of 20. So there's a lot of difference now on before and the present. I just hope that we would overcome the governor's veto. It doesn't make sense. It is certainly should not be what Manchester stands for and looks out as a red state that wants to kill people. That just isn't New Hampshire. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for your testimony, Representative. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you very much.
The chair will call Phil Runyon.
Good afternoon. My name is Phil Runyon. I'm from Peterborough. I've been a member of the New Hampshire Bar for 44 years. I was the presiding justice of the 8th Circuit Court in Jaffrey for 27 years until I had to retire last year. That's a subject for another day. But nearly everything that I had intended to say has already been said by someone else, so I won't repeat it. Although my court was not a death penalty court, if you will, I can tell you this. Criminals are not deterred by the consequences of their crimes. They don't think about the consequences of their crimes at all. Most of the crimes that are committed in such a way that they don't have time to think about the consequences. The situations where they may think about the consequences ahead of time, say they're premeditated, they don't think they're going to be caught, and so that's not deterring them. New Hampshire has executed 24 people since 1734. That's 24 people in 284 years. It hasn't executed anyone since 1939. If you asked me what my chances were in assessing whether to commit a crime or not, I don't think I would feel deterred by those kinds of statistics. Let me also just say from the standpoint of, well, some crimes are so heinous that we owe it to the families of victims to provide the ultimate retribution. Of the people who have been through this process, the families who have been through this process, most of them say, once they know what they were getting into, that they wish they had never been through it in the first place. When you don't have the death penalty, people are much more likely to plead guilty to a sentence of life without chance of parole. They're not fighting for their lives, so they're not going to be prolonging that process for as long as they possibly can. So the case is over with, and they're in jail, and that's closure, if you will. When there's the death penalty, though, they fight on and on and on at great expense. It's been described for 10 or 20 years. During that time, the families have to worry about that all the time. Is the conviction going to be overturned on some technicality? Are they going to have to perhaps go through the whole trial process again? And then the whole new level of appeals begins again? It's just not really fair to those families to put them through that sort of thing. And finally, I guess, I agree with those who say we don't belong in the same family of nations with the ones that endorse the death penalty. That's not the kind of country we want to be, and we shouldn't be perpetuating this any longer than we absolutely have to. So, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm strongly in favor of this bill. I urge you not only to pass it, but if it is vetoed, to override the governor's veto. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony this afternoon, Mr. Runyon.
There's always an appeal. Those cases are always appealed.
How many?
Of the 24 that were?
No. If you lose your appeal,
there are many levels of appeals. They're the state court appeals, then there are the federal court appeals. There are many, many levels of appeals. So even though you lose at one level on one theory, you appeal to another court on a different theory. Some of the theories are state constitutional bases. Some are federal constitutional bases. They really do go on at great length, which is why the process does take 10 or 20 years often. Oh, definitely. Yes, it does. I don't know what the statistics are there, but it certainly does, because all the death penalty cases are appealed. The life without parole penalties often result from a plea, because they don't want to have to worry about the death penalty. If you don't have it, they don't have to worry about it. They plead guilty under those circumstances much more frequently. But the death penalty always generates the maximum number of appeals.
Are there any further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you for letting me say a few words. I won't read testimony, but I too have been taking some notes, and I have to say that I really wish the governor would be sitting right here listening to this testimony. I think it's absolutely compelling. Absolutely compelling. And to threaten a veto, especially when we're dealing with the death penalty. Let me tell you a little bit about myself, and I reviewed my testimony from the last time we were here, and I really wish you would use me as a bit of a resource. I, like Mr. Merkin, have been practicing over 39 years. I started in the state of New Hampshire with the Public Defender Program, and in 1982 we began the Homicide Defense Project in New Hampshire. From 1982 to 1988, not only was I the homicide lawyer, one of them, in that project, I also was the deputy director of the New Hampshire Public Defender Program. I prepared and or tried over 100 murder cases in this state. I have also had to run head up with a capital case. A particular case was the case that led Barbara Keshen, who testified here, to leave the Attorney General's office. And let me go through a little list for you of what that case was about. That case was referred to by Senator French. And it was the State versus Johnson, Puff, Carroll case. 3 individuals that the state claimed were involved with the murder for hire of Mr. Johnson's wife. And the case started because a state trooper in this state that does it right, came to a decision himself to come up with and advocate for the death penalty in a capital case and a capital charge. Later on in this case, you're going to hear me say it, so I might as well just say it now. During the trial of this case, a very serious case, this state trooper, the number one investigator for the state of New Hampshire on a death penalty case, was found in contempt during the trial by the presiding justice. But let's move on from the arrest. From the arrest under the statute that was testified to by my friend and colleague, Chuck Douglas, a statute that was put together in 1974 by primarily himself and Warren Runyon, we took an appeal before we even went to the jury, to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. That particular statute was found to be unconstitutional by our Supreme Court. This was the narrow, carefully crafted constitutional. My client spent 2.5 years pre-trial insisting on his innocence, offered deals if he wanted to plead guilty. And for a young kid, he showed admirable courage and said no. And we went to trial. The first case that was scheduled for trial was Mr. Johnson's case. Right before trial, after charging Mr. Johnson with a capital offense, the Attorney General's office was forced to null pros the case, dismiss the case, because they realized they were not going to pressure Mr. Carroll or Mr. Pop into testifying against him. So Mr. Johnson got to go home without a trial. The next case up was Mr. Pop. And after a 6 or 7 week trial, a case where the state of New Hampshire insisted on killing my client at the beginning of the litigation, a jury returned with a not guilty verdict. Not a lesser offense, not something that was a kidnapping, not something that was an assault, not something that was a second-degree murder, but a not guilty. The third trial was the trial of Mr. Carroll. He had to be tried twice. His first trial hung. It was a deadlock jury. And in the second trial, the jury returned with a lesser included offense. So in a case where the state of New Hampshire, who always does it right, charged 3 people with capital murder and was going to kill them, they came up with 0 for 3, included. I won't even go into the economics of that monster, because, quite frankly, I really don't care about the economics. I'm not here to talk about the economics. What I've seen and what I reviewed from the last time I testified till today was that this issue maybe has come off the tracks a little bit. Maybe it's not about economics. And frankly, maybe it's not about justice if we start looking at ourselves here. Maybe it's about politics. And if it's about politics, it's not about the citizens of New Hampshire anymore. We've gone the wrong direction. If it's about politics, it's not about the citizens of New Hampshire. If it's about worrying about Michael Addison and what will happen to him, it's not about the 1.5 million other people in the state of New Hampshire. I would ask you to place the 1.5 million people out there in the state of New Hampshire above Michael Addison and his legal team and their troubles that, by the way, will go on now, certainly for over 2 or 3 decades. Names have been thrown out here that I know too much about. Okay, Richard Buchanan. Barbara Keshen represented Richard Buchanan at the Public Defenders. After he was released, I represented Richard Buchanan. You cannot put a person's life back together after they've been accused of murdering and raping a child and placed into a jail cell, where not only was he not guilty, he was absolutely innocent. Absolutely innocent. I've heard about rehabilitation. And I've heard the name of Officer Miller. I represented Cleo Roy. He's the young man that killed Officer Miller. He killed a cop. He was released from prison last year. The chief of police for Manchester Police Department came to his parole hearing and did not oppose his release. He is on the street. He is working. He is trying his best to be a productive human being. There are too many stories out there and too many people I think maybe I know too much about. Right? But the one thing I do know an awful lot about, because I've been in the jail cells and I've had to interview these people, the worst of the worst. And I agree. I agree so much with police officers, and I agree so much with defense attorneys. Do you honestly think that people sit down and calculate? If you walk down the street today and you pull somebody aside and said, what are you going to get for having 7 ounces of cocaine on? They don't know the difference between one murder and another murder, and they don't shop around for states that are light on sentences versus states that are tough on sentences. That's a myth. It's wrong. There's nothing to support it. Don't ever believe it. So I guess, what I'm really asking you to do, and I can go through this whole litany of mistakes. I've been through the best science in the world when I started was ABO typing on blood. We've come a long way. And they still make mistakes on DNA, by the way. What I guess I'll ask you to do is, you should use the people in this room, really, as a major resource. And you should can this tape and send it over to the governor before he proclaims that he's going to veto something before he sees what's on his desk. I truly believe that it's time to put the antique away. I don't know what we're doing, holding on to a statute and a law that hasn't been used in 79 years. It seems like an awful waste. It's not even a tool in the toolbox. It hasn't been used. It shouldn't be used. And we should end it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The chair will call Dr. Leonard.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and the rest of the committee. I'm Dr. Leonard Korn. I am a psychiatrist. I've been practicing in Portsmouth, New Hampshire for 44 years. I am currently the president of the New Hampshire Medical Society, although I come here as a psychiatrist and physician, not representing the medical society. There are many arguments on both sides of the aisle for or against the death penalty, many more against the death penalty than for. The arguments for repeal are religious, moral, pragmatic, legal, financial, medical, and psychiatric, psychological. Maybe there are others as well. I'm going to talk about the medical and psychological, psychiatric issues. And people have talked about that to some extent already today. Organized medicine, the American Medical Association, and all medical associations prohibit physicians from participating in the process of killing prisoners. That's been the case since 1980. The reason for this prohibition of physicians is that a physician is supposed to be dedicated to providing competent medical care with compassion and respect for human life. Well, we can't obviously participate in the death penalty because of that. It's unfortunate that less qualified medical personnel have been employed in the procedures of administering lethal injections, often inadequately and always inhumanely, in violation of these important ethical principles. And we're all aware that Governor Sununu has suggested two reasons for opposition to the death penalty and why he has stated he would veto this bill if it came to his desk. I certainly hope that he will listen to the arguments and reconsider. He expressed interest in supporting crime victims and supporting the death penalty for what he refers to as the most heinous crimes. I think we can all agree that there's no more heinous crime than murder. And in the United States, last year there are well beyond 11,000 murders. Now, if we were able to prosecute all of them successfully, would we want to kill all of those criminals? What about the mistakes, as we've talked about? But are some murders really more heinous than others, more egregious? With all due respect, and I mean this sincerely, is a school teacher's death by murder, or a brother or sister's death by murder, or a child's death by murder, and we've seen many of those recently, is that less heinous or less egregious than murder of a policeman? As a psychiatrist, I've been involved and interested in violence for all of my career. There's certainly much violence in our world and in our country. As a society, we need to focus on reducing violence, not condoning it. Violence, of course, comes in many forms, from bullying in our schools to sexual, physical, and emotional abuse in our homes and workplaces, and of course murder in our homes and workplaces and in our streets. We certainly don't punish bullies by bullying them, nor should we punish abusers by abusing them. And we certainly shouldn't punish murderers by murdering them. Elective murder by the state is not the best we can do as a civilized society. Indeed, it is a form itself of violence. We can do better, and we should. It's not a good example to murder, to show that murder is wrong. Let me discuss healing, as healing from wounds is what physicians try to do our best in medicine. Psychiatrists, of course, focus on emotional wounds, which, as we know, can be as traumatic and long-lasting as physical wounds, if not more so, often more so. Emotional wounds can last a lifetime, or even actually longer, as I've heard stories about children of Holocaust victims, and those wounds continue to the children of parents. Murder of a loved one is such a trauma, such an emotional wound, that healing as best is a long and torturous road, requiring as much support and love as a family and community can provide. Do we honestly think that punishing a convicted murderer by death, taking, well, and we've talked about this so much today, 10 or 20 years, is helping that process of healing? Many family members, colleagues, and friends will tell you that no, that doesn't help the process of healing at all. In fact, many years of publicity and personal experiences by family and others perpetuates the pain and reopens the wounds of such a violent death. Administering the death penalty just interferes with healing. It doesn't promote it. It interferes with closure for the victims of murder rather than strengthening the laws for crime victims, as the governor has suggested. Many family members of victims of murder oppose the death penalty, but those that do not, unfortunately, very likely prolong their own grief and their own healing and their own suffering, and they interfere with the ability to heal. Now, in thinking about wounds related to the death penalty, there's another important factor to consider, namely the emotional wounds inflicted on those individuals who were involved in the procedures and administration of the death penalty. As a member of the New Hampshire Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, I've heard and read about the effects on those individuals who participate in the process of administering the death penalty. I'm talking about wardens, prison workers, prosecutors, defense attorneys who have been part of that process. And those individuals experience depression, anxiety, PTSD as a result of participating in the death penalty. So we, instead of helping to heal the wounds, we just increase the wounds that our society and that our individuals have to deal with. So we know that killing is only reasonable, as religious people have discussed already today, if we have no other choice than to defend ourselves or others. But I don't think we want to continue to subject so many individuals and state workers to this heinous process of killing when parole without available is an alternative. Now, I've discussed only some of the sound and reasonable reasons for ending the death penalty, especially as it relates to medicine and psychiatry. I'm reminded often of John Donne's poem, No Man is an Island, 17th century poem. And in the end, he continues in this way. Any man's death diminishes me, for I'm involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Dr. Clark. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you.
I've got some testimony here.
Yes, please, make sure you give it to our
Thank you very much.
The chair will call Robert Spencer.
I'll be very brief. I actually signed up to speak because I hadn't heard what I wanted to say. But I think Dr. Cohen did allude to it, but I'll be very, very brief in emphasizing my concern, which extends a little bit further than he said. So I'm also a physician. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm board certified in hospice and palliative medicine. Having talked with many people at the end of their lives who have participated in intentional killing, veterans who have participated in killing in warfare, even colleagues who have participated with assisted suicide. I haven't spoken directly with corrections officers, but I have read accounts of those who have also participated in lawful executions, intentional killing, and the impact at the end of their lives that these acts can have, the way it can haunt people, has been profound. And the only point I wanted to add to that and extend it is that I think using the death penalty in New Hampshire makes not only those corrections officers or other people that are physically taking the act of killing implicit and haunted by that, but I think it makes me as a citizen of New Hampshire and all of us as citizens of New Hampshire complicit in the intentional killing of another human being, and that will haunt us as well. And I plead with you to take the steps necessary to avoid that experience for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spencer. Dr. Spencer, are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you. Okay, we're down to the last speaker. Representative Cushing, you asked to go last.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm going to be really brief.
I want to thank Senator Abard for sponsoring the bill. I want to thank the other 12 sponsors of this bill. I'm reflecting on the fact that it was 20 years when I first sponsored. 20 years have passed since the first time I sponsored legislation that related to the death penalty. I think that everything that's important to say has been said today. I trust the wisdom of the committee to make an appropriate decision. I would hope that would be to recommend passage of the Senate bill because New Hampshire can live without the death penalty. Thank you. Yes.
What 20 years? What led to your 20 years of passion on this?
Well, my father was shot unto death in front of my mother, and so I have a personal journey that has been part of it. When I was in the legislature in the 1998, there was a series of heinous murders that took place in the state, and there was a, kind of a cry to expand the death penalty. I found myself in the situation of being someone who was, I was a stakeholder. I had to make a decision about how I stood on it and actually vote on it. And at the time, the decision was whether we keep the death penalty where it is or expand it. And I thought that wasn't what we needed to be talking about. We needed to be talking about doing away with it altogether. And part of that came from my victim's experience. The hardest thing about being a victim is coming to realize that you can't change the past. But what you can do is make some decisions about the future. And the problem with the death penalty is that what it doesn't do is the one thing that you really want, and that's to be able to change that past and to bring your loved one back. The death penalty doesn't do it. I came to know, I've had conversations with hundreds of other family members of murder victims. I worked for 20 years as a victim's advocate. And part of what we try to do is we have a criminal justice system that's a lot about winning, losing, and punishing, but it's not so much about kind of truth-telling and healing. And I just came to conclude that the death penalty was just a failed public policy. I saw other things that were being ignored. I remember speaking, trying to figure out how come there's 120 unsolved homicide cases in the state of New Hampshire, and we don't put much resources into that, but we can elevate. It was this hierarchy of victims I didn't like a subset of victims get elevated up as the ones that really matter, and those other cases, just get ignored. I find the state has been lax in services for homicide victims. We don't have a homicide support group in the state of New Hampshire. We max out at $30,000 for victims assistance. So that prompted me to do it. And if anything, on March 28, 2011, my brother-in-law was also murdered by an assault pistol in front of his home. And if anything, that experience reinforced my opposition to the death penalty. So when I have this public policy debate, I have an intellectual head about what we should be doing, but I also see it all through the lens of someone who's a survivor of 2 homicide victims. And every time I talk about this, I can't help but recall what it was like to close the coffin lid on a couple of gunshot-riddled bodies of people that you love.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much, Dr. Smith.
Thank you.
Okay, we are going to go ahead and close the public hearing on Senate Bill 593. Okay, committee. Come in, please. We're going to be,
Yes, okay. Okay, very good. You will, okay, yeah, let me know. Thank you. What's that? I want to see if they're going to accept. Okay.